as we settle in some time together. And I'd invite you to do, as we begin, to do what we did last week, which is what I called assume the position, like this, hands open in front of you. I talked about last week how I grew up in the church, and I was told early on, like, this is how you should hold your hands as you go up for communion. You know, like, oh, you make the little manger for the bread of Christ to come. Anyway, so that's just something that I've always done, and you don't have to do that, but we talked about last week, too, how this is something that we do. Is we got to celebrate last week 7 of our young people as they had their first communion celebration together. And so we also named how this posture, these open hands that we have, and the whole practice of Holy Communion is one that is dangerous, that it's one that is uncomfortable for us. We read from Rachel Held Evans how she named how she resists it every time, this posture that names our need to receive. And receiving is hard. And again, just how we kind of started the service this morning, it's been a week of remembering that. The headlines with Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, you know, we're heartbroken in the midst of being reminded of the dark, painful, lonely reality of mental illness, of depression, of anxiety. And it's hard. I mean, we just name that. It's hard to open our hands, to be people who receive, who are open. So we're reminded of that this week. That's why we practice together every time that we're here on Sunday. We open our hands during Holy Communion. We receive, and we do this every time that we're together because receiving takes practice. It becomes a practice for us. We practice opening our hands, walking up in front of the whole church saying, yes, I need something too. Like that we hold that together, that space of saying yes with who we are. It's incredible that this posture of waiting, of relinquishing, of being vulnerable, all of it is the thing that is central to the life of Jesus. Always coming back to Jesus' table with open hands. So I invite you just to return to that posture if it's comfortable for you while you're sitting, just holding your hands open. Because today we're going to continue to hold our hands open, not only because we're going to come back to Jesus' table later, but because of another way in which the Jesus story invites us to hold our hands open, which is where we're going to head today. You ready? Can we do that? Cool. So I feel like I'm going to get into a lot of different questions and things to really hold, so I invite you to really, be with me. Are you with me? Are you ready? There's going to be a lot of kind of stuff that comes up, so I invite you to really just hang on for the ride and come along too. So to get there, we're going to turn to a story that Jesus told in one of the Gospels, one of the 4 biographies of Jesus. In one of those stories, it's one of those stories that gets our attention even now. And if we're paying attention, this story has the potential to offend us. So this is going to be really fun. So this is a parable. Parables were the stories that Jesus used that had layers to them, that said a lot through just a little. And this particular parable is called the parable of the 10 minas, M-I-N-A-S. It's in Luke 19, 12 through 16. And as we read, as always, I invite you to really envision this as you see it, what it looks like, get caught up in the details of it, listen to what gets your attention about it. It's a little bit long, so I kind of want to describe what we're going to hear before we hear it. So there's a man of royal birth, and he goes off to get the official approval to actually become king. So he goes off to do that, but before he goes, he entrusts 10 of his servants with a large sum of money. Each with a mina is the measurement of that money. It's about 1/3 of their annual income. So whatever you make, take 1/3 of that. That's what they got. So he hands each of those 10 servants a mina worth of money, and he asks them to take care of it, to invest that money, and that he would check in on them and on the money when he got back. And so we're going to see the king come back and check in with 3 of those servants and see what they did with it and his response to those 3 servants and the choices that they made. So as Jesus is setting this up, almost as an aside, kind of as he sets it up, he describes how the citizens of that area, they hate this would-be king. They do not like this guy. They bring a petition against him. They don't want him to be king, but he becomes king anyway, which is, as he's telling this, is actually a veiled reference to himself. So Jesus is naming how he has come as king to lead them in a particular way, into a new way of life, and they don't like the way this life is looking, and so they try to stop him. So just also as we read this, we hold that too, that to be clear, Jesus is talking about himself, and he's talking about us in this too. Metaphor, there it is, right there. So just that's playing out, so we're going to dig into it on that level after we hear this too. So I think Matt's reading. Come on up. So Luke 19, here's how it goes.
There once was a man descended from a royal house who needed to make a long trip to headquarters to get authorization for his rule and then return. But first, he called 10 servants together, gave them each a sum of money, and instructed them, "Operate with this until I return." But the citizens there hated him, so they sent a commission with a signed petition to oppose his rule. "We don't want this man to rule us." When he came back, bringing the authorization of his rule, he called those 10 servants to whom he had given the money to find out how they had done. The first said, "Master, I doubled your money." He said, "Good servant, great work. Because you've been trustworthy in this small job, I'm making you governor of 10 towns." The second said, "Master, I made a 50% profit on your money." He said, "I'm putting you in charge of 5 towns." The next servant said, "Master, here's your money safe and sound. I kept it hidden in the cellar. To tell the truth, I was a little afraid. I know you have high standards and hate sloppiness, and don't suffer fools gladly." He said, "You're right that I don't suffer fools gladly, and you've acted the fool. Why didn't you at least invest the money in securities, so I would have at least gotten a little interest on it?" Then he said to those standing there, "Take the money from him and give it to the servant who doubled my stake." They said, "But master, he has already doubled." He said, "That's what I mean. Risk your life and get more than you ever dreamed of. Play it safe and end up holding the bag."
Dun, dun, dun. This is the Message version of this text, so it's a little bit different if you've heard this before. Thank you, Matt. There's so much going on in this text, but again, I invite you to be mindful of that, assuming the position. Because open hands are not only a posture of receiving, right, of being open to receive, but it's also a posture of giving. The yes and to what we do with what is placed in our hands. And this story, Jesus tells about a king and servants. It captures something of this posture of giving. And we're going to dig into the story a bit and see what we can find out about generosity, even though particularly the way it ends does not feel very generous at all. So to go back to the beginning of it, what we just heard, I wonder, did this get under your skin at all? Because Jesus, again, sets us up, and he's saying that we're somebody else's servants in somebody else's land with somebody else's stuff. And here's the kicker, we're not entitled to any of it. It's not ours. So did you pick up on that? And if you didn't, but if you do now, does that get to you? I would guess this isn't a new idea for us. We already probably know that the scriptures keep teaching over and over again about stuff and creation and our time and all that we have. Over and over, we're told that God owns it all, it's all God's. The story of God, the larger narrative, it just keeps inviting us into this massive paradigm shift about how we see our stuff. To see that it's not ours. We actually don't own anything. We only have it because God decided to give it to us for now. And to be clear, that's what Jesus lays out at the outset of the story, right? It all ain't ours. But just because we've heard that, it doesn't mean that we like it. It doesn't mean that it's something that's necessarily kind of seeped into the way we see things or the way that we function in the world. I know that this is hard for me. So we just pause to ask, does this work for us? Does it work for you? There's already shiftiness in the room. So check in with yourself right now. How does this sit with you as you see these open hands that you have, all that is placed into them, including who you are and your gifts and capacity as God places into your hands, your time, your home, your car, your children, your partner, your friends, your money, all that you have and all that you are. It actually all is God's, given for the purpose of what God will do with it as we use it and even as we give it away for what God will do with it. So that's where this story starts. I invite us just to be in touch with that piece of the larger narrative of God that's there and just to own our squirminess, our reactions, our yeses, our no's, so whatever receptivity or resistance we have to that being a part of the story of God. If I should just hold that as we then just take our pulse on that as we as we pay attention to this paradigm shift that we're invited into, and then as we dive more into the story. Okay, so hold on to that. Be in touch with yourself there. Okay, got it? Holding it, paying attention? Okay. So then Jesus gets into this story then just to capture what can happen when something is placed into our open hands, right? So what happens? What can we do? And oh man, that third servant, whoops, right? I mean, and that's really the point of the story. Jesus takes that third servant, and he's the failure, he's the tragic character in the unfolding of this story. Jesus is obviously making a point between the first and second servants contrasted against this third servant, right? And it's easy to see that what the third servant did, but really what he didn't do, right? He didn't do anything with the money. It says he put it in the cellar. Other versions say he wrapped it in a cloth, like he put it away. He hid it. But what's more interesting than the what that he did is really looking at the why that he did it, why he kind of did nothing. And what does he say? This is what he says about it. He says, I was a little afraid. I know you have high standards and you hate sloppiness and you don't suffer fools gladly. Other translations say, I knew you were a hard man. So do you see how the third servant perceives the king, right? His take on who the king is. He doesn't see him very highly. He's unreasonable. He's hard. And yet notice how this perception doesn't line up with reality. The servant says the king's unreasonable, he's hard, yet this third servant has seen what the king does. And it's like he doesn't actually know him. The king is a man of great provision and wealth, and he entrusts his wealth to his servants. He took a risk on the servant. He didn't have to do that. The servant says the king is unreasonable, yet he saw the way that the king treats those who follow his direction. He rewards their faithfulness with more opportunity. Is that an unreasonable man? I don't think so. That seems pretty generous. That seems trusting. But we watch as the third servant has fabricated a false profile of the king that gives himself permission to stay safe and comfortable. I'll say that again. This third servant has fabricated a false profile of the king that gives himself permission to stay safe and comfortable. Do you see that? The third servant's perception, his projections of who the king is, it's kept his hands closed up tight with the money hidden away in fear. Which makes me wonder then about the first two servants. The text doesn't say, it doesn't give them a chance to speak about their perceptions of the king, but we can venture to guess that they must have known that their king to be someone who's trusting of, who's generous with them. And that perception then flows into the open hands and the risky, generous ways in which they are willing to say yes with what has been given to them. Do you see how Jesus is making a connection to how the perceptions that we have about Jesus, about God, that they flow into the way in which we hold our hands and our stuff, all the things that are placed into them? Our perception of God is connected to that flow of generosity. So as you consider your own hands and that first question of, how do we respond to knowing that all that we have belongs to God? It's just on loan for a while. The question that we also ask is one of, who do you see God to be? Do you see God as hard and unreasonable, as trusting and generous, as something else in between? We don't have to fall into these two kind of polarizations that we find in this particular parable, but how do you see God? And in answering this question of how you see God, I would invite you to not just look at your ideas or thoughts or theological reflection on who God is, but to actually look at your behaviors, your actions, your response. How do you actually live? What you actually do with your time and your money and your talents. And ask, what fuels that? What is the flow? What's the connection between who you see God to be and the way that you live with your stuff? Jesus contrasts these two responses to draw attention to how we perceive God and to invite us to orient ourselves towards a God who actually is generous and trusting with us. So I invite you to kind of sit in that space, considering your perceptions of who God is. And as we do that, there's a song and a video that I want us to see that captures what it can look like, put together by the folks at workofthepeople.com. It's a song, it uses a song by Glenn Phillips. He used to be the lead singer of Toad the Wet Sprocket. Any fans? Anyone? Toad the Wet? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And this particular song, I've loved it for a long time, but we'll see the lyrics on the screen and then interspersed with some quotes from Mary Oliver. There's not a lot to it, and yet it orients us just in this posture of open hands. So I invite you to receive it that way, but hearing how we can live in this posture of risky, courageous, yes, and with a God who entrusts and gives to us so that we can also live generously.
You made this world, you made this world, you made this world. Thank you, thank you. You gave me life, you gave me life, you gave me life. Thank you, thank you. You brought this peace, you brought this peace, you brought this peace. You sowed these seeds, you sowed these seeds, you sowed these seeds. Thank you. Your love is everywhere. Your love is everywhere. Open me, open me. Your love is everywhere. Your love is everywhere. Open me, open me, open me. You kept me warm, you kept me warm, you kept me warm. When I was in the wasteland, when I was in the wars, when I was all alone. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Your love is everywhere. Your love is everywhere. Open me, open me, open. Your love is everywhere. Your love is everywhere. Your love is everywhere. Open me, open your love, love. Oh, your love. Open me, yeah. Let it come through me now. Let it come through me now. Let it come through me now. Let it come through. Let it come through me now. Let it come through me. Let it come through me. Let your love, love.
Everywhere, everywhere.
Your love is everywhere. Open me, open me, open. Your love is everywhere. Your love is everywhere. Oh, you're everywhere. Open me, open me, open me. Open me, oh yeah. Open me, yeah. like you.
This parable from Jesus and this song from Glenn Phillips both ask us, what will you do with what you've been given? What will you do with what you've been given? When it all belongs to God, our generous God, we have the incredible opportunity to say yes and to God and to hold our hands open to the God who made this world, who gave us life, who brought this peace, who sowed these seeds, who kept us warm, whose love is everywhere. It's the invitation into yes and by living the prayer of the open me, so that the love of God, the generosity of God can flow through us, holding our hands open to the flow of generosity from our God who entrusts in us and to us. That's what we see in these first two servants, their yes and to giving away that which God entrusted to them, hands held open with what they had. So it is with us. God gives to us so that God can give through us. We are made for this. We are made to collaborate, right? To collaborate with God. It's the series that we're in right now. We get to explore this landscape of collaboration this whole summer in our sermon series that we're in. But today we say the definitive word that when it comes to our money, when it comes to our stuff and who we are, God is absolutely inviting us to collaborate. Jesus talked more about money than he talked about anything else. He said more about money than he did about love, than forgiveness, than feeding the hungry, than justice. Jesus spoke more about money, probably because Jesus knew that money and the resources that we have in every sense are the single greatest resource that God can use in this world to leverage love, to leverage transformation, to leverage healing and justice in our world. That's why we need to hold our hands open so that God can collaborate with us in all of the ways that we are given to. I think this is a beautiful and compelling way to look at our lives, a way to live open, and yet it is so hard, right? It is so hard. So coming back to just your own pulse within you, your own sense of just how you hold this and how you hold all that is given to you, how we sit with knowing that all of it is God's. We ask together, like that third servant, are there excuses that we make or projections about God that we have been holding, that we cling to in order to stay safe and comfortable? For the record, man, I know that I do. I default to being the third servant. Like that is me. Like, anyone with me? So I grew up in a house where we always had enough, but always like just enough, right? Like that was kind of the financial place that we lived in, just enough to get by. And also my parents, they were so good at making things fair between me and my two brothers that I just so easily default to closed hands because I have this deeply held sense that there are appropriate measurable things that I am due, right? Like this is what is owed to me, that would be fair, right? So like that is like such a hard thing for me then to be like, what do you mean it's not all mine? Like that's really hard for me. And it's been so funny too, just in the process of working on all of this, like one of our cars died, like transmission done, so we had to like buy a new car. So we've been very much immersed in the like realities of financial world and how you make decisions. And is this our money? Is this God's money? What about this loan? Is that our money? Is that anyway? Just like all of those things have been very real for us, especially in this past week. But I've been very aware of I am wired to like hold tight. Like that's a default setting for me. But thankfully, I have learned so much about living generously, especially since I said yes to being a pastor of this new thing that has become Salt House, because we have said yeses together with open hands that my own tight, closed fists would not have been able to let go of if it had just been me. We are living a story of generosity, of opening our hands to give away. We've given away our basement to families experiencing homelessness, to have a place to be during the day, to receive services and case management and care. We've sold 1/6 of our property for families and for women experiencing homelessness. We've said these yeses, and we did it when we had not very many people. We had 0 extra money. We were living off of grant money at the time, holding it open. So I just say thank you for practicing open hands with me, because that has been changing me through this. And it just is such an example of how we need each other to be able to practice that together. And what have we seen as a community? I feel like we've seen what the first 2 servants experienced, that when we risk what we have been entrusted, there's this return on investment, right, that we can't imagine. They saw 50 and 100%. And again, I don't think this is a literal, measurable, okay, so if we get 50% back or 100, no, it's this is speaking of the essence of what happens when we step into what God is doing and say yes with what we have. And when we have said yes, we've seen too that God will keep giving us more opportunities, just like it was for those first 2 servants. He said, okay, great, why don't you try ruling these cities, take over these things too. And it's just breathtaking to consider how we've collaborated with God so far and how those opportunities keep coming for us to say yes together. So today, Sean mentioned at the beginning, but after worship is another chance for us to see how we can hold our hands open as a community and say yes together. Not in the same way. We're not going to give away part of our building today. We're not going to sell more property today. That's not going to happen as far as I know. But we do need to collaborate together with God and each other in voting on a few things, including our budget for the fiscal year that will begin on July 1st. I mean, you guys, this is full-on adulting here. Let's talk about our budget. It's good. So this is our first of many annual meetings that we will have every year on the 2nd Sunday of June to check in about the state of our congregation and to just as a community collaborate with God in how we use our money, our financial resources here at Salt House, practicing holding our hands open together and saying yes, that this is what we want to do with God in the year to come. So I'm grateful not only that we get to do that work, that we get to collaborate in that together with our resources, but that we do it in a way that is transparent and accountable. Our finance team and our leadership council have tended to and approved the budget as it stands, and they're recommending it to us to review and vote on today. So I'm just very grateful for that process. And it is very vital work that we do, even as it feels very institutional and very adult for us to do this work together. But that's what we do to follow Jesus in these modern times and as a community that has resources. So thank you that just as we practice the dangerous act of opening our hands to receive Holy Communion every Sunday, we also together practice the dangerous, uncomfortable posture of unfurling our fingers so that we can hold loosely that which we have so that God can use it. So we get to practice that too. So in response to all of this that we've kind of said in these last few minutes, I have a few invitations for you. So first, I would invite you to stick around for our meeting and bring your questions and your spirit of generosity into the meeting that will follow in just a few minutes. Can you do that? Yes, are we sticking around? If you need to go, that's okay. Life happens. Go if you need to go, but do stick around if you can. And second, I would invite you into, just in light of all that we've covered this morning, to come back to the 2 questions that we often ask here at Salt House, to listen for these 2 questions. So first, with all that you've been hearing, first just live in this question. What is God saying to me? So to ask that question and then get to what am I going to do about it. But first, stay in the first question. Where and how is this hitting you? Where are you feeling agitated, excited? What's getting stirred up in you about your own posture of who you think God to be, of how you hold your hands and what you've been given? What are the ways in which you find it hard to loosen that grip? And including, as you think about this, I would invite you to consider how you hold your hands open with Salt House, how you do already, as well as what that might look like in the future. In a few minutes, we're going to be voting on this budget, which assumes, it's only made possible with the commitment of this community. We exist because you all are willing to give what God has given you back into the work and ministry that is happening here at Salt House. We are able to collaborate with God because of all y'all who show up with open hands and give of your time and your gifts, and yes, because of your willingness to give financially into the mission of God here in this place. Because you see that God's love is everywhere. And you see the collaboration that we do here as a way to amplify that voice and that presence of God's love and inclusion and welcome and justice. We are able to do that work because of all of your open hands, receiving and giving week in and week out. And for that, for you, we are so, so grateful. So my friends, these are the questions. What is God saying to you in all of this? What will you do? And as a final nudge, as we kind of shut this down, I invite us back to the ominous end of our reading today. Do you remember what that last sentence was? It may sound different now, but Jesus says this: risk your life and get more than you ever dreamed of. Play it safe and end up holding the bag. It is dangerous opening our hands, both receiving and giving. And this is exactly what the Jesus story invites us into. What is God saying to you today as we ask together, what will you do with what you have been given? So we're going to listen and take a few moments to sing before heading to Jesus' table together. But as we do that, I invite you to assume the position, to close your eyes, and let's pray.